as we understand abuse and neglect, you will have seen that you have some documents there for you to read and things to find out about, and we're welcoming you back to another video at this point. We just want to go over a few key factors, and then we're going to continue to move on because you've already read it and I don't feel like you have to read it and me go over every detail. So the definition that we go by for child abuse and neglect: child abuse, which includes child neglect is a form of child abuse. Let's be really clear, although we typically differentiate, really neglect is a form of abuse. So child abuse is when a parent or caregiver, whether through action or failing to act, causes injury, death, emotional harm, or risk of serious harm to a child. There are many forms of child maltreatment, including neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, exploitation, and emotional abuse. Boy, there's a lot to unpack there. So when you have that 6-month-old who's screaming and screaming and screaming, and they're not moving their arm anymore, and you do not take them into the doctor, that is a form of child abuse because that is medical neglect. Not having your child go to school every day and being truant and then them not being able to pass their classes is educational neglect. Obviously, sexual abuse, sexual exploitation, sex trafficking, or labor trafficking in a child, these are all forms of abuse. It is action or inaction, depending on the circumstance. It's really important to understand that. We have had cases where that neglect has become abusive because they failed to act, when they failed to protect a child, or they failed to take the child into the doctor, or things like that. All right, I'm going to go over the warning signs of abuses. Now, I would argue that I really honestly believe that emotional abuse is one of the absolute worst things that can happen to a child, because even sexual abuse, to a certain extent, you can make it through therapy and get over, and I'm not saying it's easy. None of it is easy. None of it is easy for anyone, child or adult, to get over. However, there are more helps in place and things like that. The reason why I really feel like emotional abuse is the worst is because that becomes the voice in your head, tearing you down, moving you away from overcoming that trauma. And it's there. And it's so much harder to silence that voice in your head. That is one of the reasons why I think emotional abuse is one of the worst things that could happen. And so what are some of the signs of emotional abuse? They might be really withdrawn, anxious about doing anything wrong. Like this is a child that, like, if you are like, oh, look, you did an amazing job on the picture, or you did an amazing job on that test, man, you got 99 out of 100 right, they are going to freak out. What do you mean? I didn't get 100? Oh my goodness. Like, you, as if you were going to beat them physically within an inch of their life because they missed one question on the test, and you were just trying to praise them, but they don't hear it that way. They don't interpret it that way. They're super over the top. You're going to see typically very extremes in behavior. They are going to be super compliant, but sometimes they might be more passive aggressive, or they may have been checked out, overly demanding, kind of like the extremes of behavior. Let's see. They don't seem to be as attached to the parents or caregivers. They may act inappropriately. They may act really young for their age, or they may act super old for their age, taking a 6-year-old taking care of their younger siblings in an inappropriate manner, as if they are their main caregiver as opposed to a sibling. Signs of physical abuse, I think most people are pretty familiar with: frequent injuries, unexplained abuses. Well, injuries will typically have a pattern. The other thing to watch for is these kids are always on alert. They're always watchful. They are going to flinch away. They're going to try and cover up the physical evidence. That is not uncommon. Okay. So Okay, so warning signs of child neglect. There's the obvious ones: clothes don't fit, they're really dirty, frequent illnesses, not brushing their teeth, hair's really ratty, like it's not been brushed or maintained, frequently left alone, unsupervised. These are children that may have body odor, or they may be late or missing from school fairly often, that sort of thing. Warning signs of sexual abuse in children: trouble walking or sitting. If the act has been fairly recent, so to speak, they may have an STD or a pregnancy at an inappropriate age. A lot of them run away from home. This is a huge thing. We used to think runaways, the majority of runaways are really tied to sexual abuse or sex trafficking and labor trafficking. So keep that in mind. They are not going to necessarily want to participate in sports or anything that's going to make them have to change in front of other people. The absolute biggest tell, however, is that they are going to have knowledge of sexual acts way beyond their age and even have a lot of seductive behavior because they have been taught, their trauma has taught their brain that this is one of the ways that they express love and can feel love. Unfortunately, groomers out there really mess with their minds, and they get that emotional abuse as well. And this does not make for an easy time for these children at all. And so if you have a 4-year-old trying to talk about sexual acts, that's not necessarily something they're going to get on TV. We're talking way beyond what they see on TV. There's a knowledge and there's an understanding to that knowledge way beyond than just hearing about it out in the world. Okay, so I am going to go over mandated reporting. And one of the things is Kansas statutes. We don't have law. Technically, our statutes are called law. Our laws are called statutes. Excuse me. KSA 382223. When any of the following persons has reason to suspect that a child has been harmed as a result of physical, mental, or emotional abuse or neglect, or sexual abuse, the person shall report the matter promptly. Okay, so it then will go on and list a bunch of people, of which a CASA volunteer advocate is not one of them. So by statute in the state of Kansas, we are not mandated reporters. However, remember when I talked about OJA last week or earlier? And we talked about the Office of Judicial Administration oversees everything. By our agreement that allows our CASA programs to exist, our standards say you are mandated reporters. So not by statute, but by agreement with the Office of Judicial Administration in the state of Kansas, we are mandated reporters. So what does that mean? That means if you suspect or have reason to suspect that a child has been abused, neglected, even if it's sexual abuse or trafficking or whatnot, you should report the matter promptly. Now, many a time, these children are already a part of a case for that. We're not talking about re-reporting something that's already included in the case. We're talking about reporting something that is not part of the current case, that is new information to us. Now, let's look at that for a second. If we have a situation where maybe it was physical abuse and you're in a visit and this child you've built rapport and now you've built trust, and then this child says, so I really only get hit, or they really only, hit me when I don't do such and such sexual act with this person. That's sexual abuse. Or if I don't spend special time with so-and-so, that's sexual abuse as well, and that is something new. Or that would have to be reported, and you are a mandated reporter, so you would report. Let me give you another example. if we had a case where it was just neglect, right? When this was a truancy case, they were educationally neglecting their children. Maybe they weren't feeding their children, they weren't taking care of them at all, so we had to remove the children. And now you get in there and they're like, and you're like, oh, where did that come from? Because you notice a bruise on them. Oh, my mom or dad gave it to me. Oh, and you start the conversation. And I don't want to lead the conversation right now, but then you're like, well, wait, we might be talking about physical abuse. Okay, I'm going to say, as I bring up this next slide, 38, 22, 23, and then E1. Remember I said there's underneath. Some agencies would expect you to discuss this reporting. We're not those. If you suspect or have reason to suspect this is a new abuse or neglect, it is your responsibility to report it. Whether I agree or not, whether your case supervisor agrees or not, report, because what ends up happening is we already have a case. We are already involved in the case. We are not adding new trauma to this family because we have another report. There will be a lot you will hear about mandated supporting versus reporting. They're talking about that initial case item things which start the original case, but we already have a case, so we need to explore it now, because if there's other services, if there's an anger management class that a parent needs to take or both parents need to take, or now we realize there's domestic violence in the home, we want to be able to make sure that we help facilitate services by recommending services to help that family so that they can successfully reunite and reintegrate ideally. So what I will tell you is don't have to run it by us. Go ahead and report. And you would report as a mandated reporter on the DCF website. Now, our expectation is that you will report it and then you will let myself for our program or your case supervisor somewhere else ideally tell them right after you do it, because they'll give you a report number, and if you share that with your CASA program, that's great. Then we can be tracking it. We can also give heads up to anybody else along the way who may need it, like the guardian ad litem in the case or different things like that. So it's really kind of important that you do share that information right away. Now, I have had volunteers who have had to do this. Very few. We don't find new abuses all the time, but we do find them when the children become more comfortable and they share that information. And I have had volunteers come in my office and sit down and be like, okay, I don't know if I should report this or not. I'm like, okay, let's work it through. And all I answer is, do you suspect or have reason to suspect that there has been abuse or neglect that was not included in the original case? And if they say yes, then I'm going to say, then my suggestion would be to report it. Reporting it does not necessarily mean anything other than there'll be an investigation, and then they'll find out, just like at the beginning of a child needed care case, was it substantiated or not substantiated. Sometimes people want a sounding board. I'm fine with that. I'm always open to having a text or a phone call, even on the cell phone, even if it's in the evening, or even if it's on a weekend or holiday. That's okay. Reach out. We'll work it through together. I will be your sounding board as you make the decision if you suspect or have reason to suspect. But I will tell you that my recommendation is almost always go ahead and report. Okay. So now that we've kind of talked about some of the warning signs, it'll help you it'll help you recognize child abuse and neglect. But I do want to talk about this, and then it's very important that you know this, but I do want to make sure you also understand another really key piece, and that is you as the CASA volunteer advocate do not ever have to determine whether there has been child abuse or neglect in a case. Just like you don't have to decide that this definitely happened before you report it as a mandated reporter. That is something for the court to decide. That is what the judge does. So you don't have to determine whether there was an incident and the child was actually abused or neglected. That is not what you're there for. You should be able to recognize the signs of abuse and neglect, and because you want to be able to advocate for a safe home for the child, And so we have to recognize if there are still ongoing abuse and neglect, and if that's the case, whether that home is then safe for the child or it's safe for the child to return home. We also admonish you to remember that child abuse can be physical, sexual, emotional, or neglect. There are lots of different ways that abuse happens, unfortunately. And so we want to make sure that you're aware of all of them and not just one of them. So one of the things is that most of the children that we serve are one of the things that most of the children we serve are actually found to be children in need of care. They are victims of abuse, neglect, and or human trafficking of one sort or another. And in the state of Kansas, this does mean that they are potentially eligible for some sort of financial assistance. Now, I will tell you, if they have a case where DCF is involved, so St. Francis for Us is involved, that means their services are provided, so they don't necessarily receive compensation for being a victim or services that they may need because they're automatically provided to them as children. However, you do need to be aware of the Crime Victims' Rights Compensation, and I'm going to take a moment and talk about that right now. We have had cases where we have had children who are eligible for this for one reason or another. So let me talk about it generally, and then I'm going to give you a couple of examples. So first of all, at your very first meeting, when you meet with the family at whatever point, so when you're meeting with the mom, when you're meeting with the dad, when you're meeting with grandparents, when you're meeting with the foster parents or the kinship placement, we just typically call them placement. So placement can be a kinship placement can be the parents, placement can be a foster parent. They're all placement, so I do want to make sure that we are all aware of that, and that way, if I call them placement, you understand what I'm talking about. So the first time you go and you introduce yourself, I will ask you, for whoever has custody of that child at that very first visit, to hand them a brochure that we have, and that is a Crime Victims' Right Compensation brochure that talks to them about what their rights are, or what the child's rights are, and potentially, and different things that they can learn about that program. We do ask you to have that person sign that you did give this to them and you did talk to them about it. You gave them the brochure and you talked to them about it briefly. So you're going to explain to them that any services that are not provided, if they're in foster care, everything is provided, so you don't have to worry about this, although we do still give the placement this and have them sign off. If they're not placed in foster care and they're placed at home or with a family member, if the case is open, they still will probably have everything taken care of. But we do want to make sure that they've initially read this off, and we have an initial visit checklist, and we will include it, but include in your visit notes that you shared this information with them. All right, I'm going to stop rambling now and get to it. So here's a situation that we actually had in Geary County a few years ago. We had two siblings. They were actually step siblings, half siblings, and they had the same mom, but they had two different dads. There was an older child who was like 17-ish, 16-ish, and one that was like 11 or 12. And both of the girls were sexually abused by the younger one's father. So he was criminally convicted of this. But because both girls came into custody at the same time, they were removed from the home. Mom was not supportive at all. It was a safety concern. She was not going to keep her husband away from her two daughters, and so it was a situation where we absolutely had to remove the children. Because the older daughter had a father who was living in another state, but had a father, she could be placed with him. She did not have to enter the foster care system. And what they ended up doing is just having that, the court had a modified agreement of custody, and the father ended up with full custody of the child. So that child did not receive services because she left the state of Kansas and went someplace else in the country. The younger child had to get taken into foster care. Now, she did go to a kinship placement, so they tried to make it the least restrictive as possible, but that younger child was provided therapy services, everything that she needed, because she was in DCF care and she was in Kansas, one of those two things, and she had an active child need a care case, so her situation was covered because she was in DCF custody. She was in the custody of the state of Kansas. However, that older child still had trauma that she had to deal with, and her father, we helped him file the form, and if anybody needs help filing the forms, that is what the CASA staff is here to do. We can help facilitate that. However, he just wanted some help getting therapy for his daughter. And so this is exactly what the Crime Victims' Rights Compensation is for, to help with therapy or small expenses that are a result of being the victim of a crime. And so we were able to help facilitate that application being filed. He was able to get the compensation. It was enough for her to go to therapy for a little while, and she was able to help deal with some of the trauma of what had happened to her. There was a point in time that it covered until he could get his older daughter or his daughter on his medical insurance and different things like that. So there is a reason why this happens. It is very important. It is an important part of your initial visit. And so when you go to your initial visit checklist, which we will share with you later, that is why this is here, so that you understand what you're talking about. All right. So now we are going to talk briefly about the court report. We've been talking about advocacy and making recommendations and everything like that. Well, the next thing we want to chat about is the actual court report. Now, this is the absolute most essential part of your work, what you do. This is where you give that judge lots of extra information to help make the best possible decision for that child and family. This is the vehicle that you use to present any information that you have gathered, what you have learned, what would be in the child and family's best interest. It is basically the visible documentation of your involvement with the case. I will tell you that judges and attorneys absolutely rely on these reports to make very informed decisions. Every CASA program or GAL program in places like North Carolina, like I said, but every CASA program is absolutely required to have a court report submitted for every court hearing. It doesn't matter if St. Francis or DCF has to have a report or not. We are required to have a report submitted for every hearing. This is not a one and done. Oh, I went, I talked to everybody, I made my decision, I submitted my one court report, and I'm done. Now I just get to hang with family. No. There's a court report due 10 business days before every single solitary hearing. Now, you may run into an instance where we had a hearing and then something happened. Maybe it was a snowstorm. We live in Kansas. Maybe it was a tornado. We live in Kansas. For some reason, maybe the judge was sick. So, and another judge couldn't, if another judge can't take their spot, they will continue that hearing. If they continue a hearing, then you don't have to do another court report. So that's the only time that you would have that happen, and your supervisor or myself would have to tell you you don't need another court report. Otherwise, you always need another court report. So let's talk about the court report a little bit more for a second. This is going to have identifying information about the child in the case, the status of the case, a brief reason for removal or the start of the case, because remember, not all children are removed. The status of the child, we're going to talk about the whole child. We'll talk more about that later. Visit information, our visits happening, our sibling visits happening if we have a sibling split, different things like that. Some programs even have what we include in our monthly report of all the visits and all the people that we talk to over the month for the case with regards to the case. Some court reports include that in the court report as well. Best interest recommendations for the best interest of the child. Any case plan progress on the part of the parents, issues, concerns, different things like that. So that's kind of the key elements of our court report. And now what I'm actually going to do and hope this all works really well, is here is what a court report looks like for us. This right here would be 24 for the year the case opened. JC stands for juvenile sync, and then there's going to be some digits at the end. So let's say it's 58. That means it's the 58th child that's come into care during the year. Let's see. It would have the child's name here, their date of birth, the parent's information, their relationship. Because remember, it might be a parent, it might be a guardian, it might be a grandparent that had custody of the child. It could be an adoptive parent. We don't know. The date that the court hearing is for, the county, so Geary County, Dickinson County, Morris County, Marion County. The honorable judge, and then you would put the judge's last name. They're the judge. The name of all the people, all the parties on the case. These are going to be typically your attorneys, and these are all the parties on the case. Your name would go here, my name would go here. You're going to have your workers. This part right here that's in red, this is very important. No one can take this particular court report and hand it to a parent or a child or the foster parent without my permission and without your permission. And it has to be mine too. It's both. It's not either one or the other. And so this is just a reminder. Now, I will tell you that the parents' attorneys will share the information in your court report, but they just can't physically hand their court report. And there have been cases where there have been issues because grandparents got a hold of a report and then released it to the press, and this is a confidential report, so that's an important thing. Down here, it'll have the case number. That just appears on every page. The same case number is up above, and the reason why that appears is that in case, so back in the day when everything was paper, if the papers fell, they would be able to figure out what case it was by. The next thing you're going to have is the CASA Advocate recommendations to the court. CASA Advocate recommends that, and then I just put in parental rights be terminated for Susie. And then what you see here is the basis. This is 2 to 3 sentences, maybe more, of all the reasons, fact-based, 100% fact-based. No opinion, no opinion, no opinion. I'm going to emphasize that a gazillion times over this training for why you're recommending that. If I am recommending that family therapy, or I am recommending, okay, let's say that that drugs and alcohol are issues with this particular case, and this is a neglect case, I might recommend that the parents have our alcohol and drug assessment. Whew, the brain was gone for a second there. And in that case, we would want to recommend that they have that assessment. And then my thing is, I could put the parent has had a history of drug arrests to include ... be very specific. The case came because the mother was both drunk and high and was driving while the child was not even seatbelted in the car. I am making this up as I go along to give you kind of an idea. And I don't have to have a whole paragraph for each thing, so we're going to throw that English rule out. We're just going to look at what happens for, these are my reasons. And if it takes me 2 sentences to say it, that's 2 sentences to say it. But like 3 or 4 reasons or 2 or 3 reasons why alcoholism is a problem, has the parent has had issues with alcoholism in the past, etc. These are all the reasons why I'm making this recommendation. The reason for removal or the reason for the beginning of the case. Why was the case started? And this could be, and it's not lengthy. This is a short, there was truancy, or we found this 2-year-old was found to be running around the neighborhood for several hours without any supervision, and that's why the case started, that kind of thing. The next, we're going to talk about this more in depth later in the training, but the child's development. Physical, how are they doing? Are they making milestones? Or are they not making milestones? Physically, are they growing appropriately? Are they healing appropriately? Emotionally, are they dealing with trauma? Are they having PTSD? You know, believe it or not, children that are victims of abuse and neglect are number 2 for PTSD, whereas our first responders like military, police, and fire are number 1 for PTSD. Children who have suffered childhood trauma are number 2. Academically, how are they doing in school? Are they active in sports? Are they doing? We want to look at the whole child and all the different things that they're doing. The child's wishes. So this is where you would write what the child wants, unless the child's an infant or unable to really understand what's going on and express their wishes, then we would just put that statement on there. Now, if the child has come from an extraordinarily abusive situation and they still love their parents, you know, that's not uncommon, and they should love their parents. They're their parents. However, if you have like a 5-year-old and that 5-year-old tells you, I just want to go home to my mommy and my daddy, and you're like, yeah, well, mom and dad are you're thinking mom and dad are in inpatient rehab right now. You can't go home. Well, that's okay. We're going to still put in here, you know, child has expressed the child would like to return to mom and dad. And then underneath you'll put, however, the CASA advocate does not, however, this is not in the child's best interest at this time. That's how you would put it. Just, this is not in the child's best interest at this time. We still want to make sure their voice is heard. That is part of what we do. It's a huge part of what we do. But we also want to be really clear that although this is what the child wants, it's not necessarily their best interest right now. Okay, parents' progress on achieving reintegration. We always want to make sure we're including any positives in here. We're going to talk more about this later. We'll actually be going over all of these and how we fill them out and what we do much more detail as we go through the training. But the parents' progress, and then you'll have one paragraph right here about mom. You'll have one paragraph here about dad, if they're both involved, anybody else along the way. And then if you have any concerns. Now, you don't have to have concerns about the case. This is the only place where you can sort of slip an opinion in. CASA is concerned that the parents are not taking this seriously as the parents don't show to appointments with the social workers or the visitation with the children, family time, things like that. You'll put your name here, you'll put the date here. I sign off on it. They're due 10 business days ahead of the schedule, and I'm going to go ahead and do that. And so I just want to make sure that you're really aware of, like, that's what our court reports look like. All right. Questions on the court reports is, remember, this is our court report here for the CASA of the 8th Judicial District. It doesn't really change much. We might tweak something here or there, but that is pretty much what our court reports are like. And that's the type of information that are included in all court reports, not just those here at CASA of the 8th.